comfortable, let us know what part of the world you're joining us from today. Also, if comfortable, please share not only reasons for you attending this groupinar, but also some things that you hope to gain through attending this groupinar. Wonderful topic, one of my favorites to present on setting boundaries, namely finding ways in which to use assertive communication to set appropriate limits and rules within relationships in your lives. So a few announcements as members get logged in and familiarize themselves with the chat pod. You all will receive a recording of this groupinar in its entirety that you'll have access to for a period of 7 days, concluding this groupinar. And yes, this works for all of the groupinars that we offer on BetterHelp. So should you see there be a groupinar, whether it be another topic I present on or some of my colleagues present on, sign up for it anyway. You can refer back to it after the fact. Again, you have access to that for a period of 7 days. Wonderful feature offered through BetterHelp. So welcome if you're just getting logged in. My name's Corey Pitts. I'll be giving a bit more of an introduction surrounding myself and background momentarily as we allow members to get logged into the space. Members joining us from all over the world today, from Texas, Central Florida, London, St. Lucia. Oh, nice. Hoping to get better at setting boundaries, especially without feeling guilty. Wonderful, wonderful. This groupinar will assist you in gaining insight on those strategies. The first half, we're going to be looking at categories of boundaries, certain types of boundaries, and then our latter half is going to be application strategies, use of assertiveness in efforts to set boundaries. And if you've not attended my assertiveness groupinar, I would highly encourage you to do that, as assertiveness is required in use of setting boundaries. So be on the lookout for that. I believe I'll be offering that again next Sunday live. But if unable to attend live, still sign up for that, as it is a wonderful supplement to this groupinar in boundary setting. So welcome to all of you getting logged in. Washington, Pennsylvania, Georgia, New York, welcome, welcome to you all joining in. And as you get logged in, familiarize yourself with the chat pod, ask questions throughout the groupinar. We'll have about 2 breaks to pause for questions. I have turned on the ability for you to label your text as a question. This will highlight the text in blue so that it highlights to myself as well as your fellow participants, so that we can reference that in our periods for breaks. So please ask questions throughout. Love to reference the questions you all have in participation of this groupinar. Someone shares they want to set boundaries with a newly separated husband while still working in the same environment. Wonderful, wonderful, great, great. A lot of what we'll be discussing includes ways in which you can revisit some of these personal boundaries, ways in which you can further solidify some of those limits and rules as they pertain to this particular context, situation, and categories in life. So welcome if you're just getting logged in. Again, my name's Corey Pitts. I'll be giving a bit more of an introduction here momentarily. Really looking forward to having this discussion with you all today surrounding concepts of boundaries and boundary setting, as it is a wonderful topic to gain more insight on and apply in life and day-to-day circumstance and situations. So we've got about another minute or so before we get started. If you're just getting logged in, welcome to you. Please familiarize yourself with the chat pod throughout. Collaborate with your colleagues. Please be mindful of what you share. No personal information, no hateful rhetoric of any sort. Please, that will not be tolerated. Never a difficulty in my group in our spaces, but always like that to be known. Support one another. Uplift one another. This is a supportive space where others are here for similar reasons. So if comfortable sharing general information, supporting one another, that is awesome. I love to see that in these group in our spaces. So as you continue to get logged in, please continue to refer to my intro message. You can also find in the shared files the content we'll be looking at available for you to download at your convenience. So I'd like to start us out with a wonderful quote by Mark Groves, and it reads, "Walls keep everyone out, but boundaries teach people where the door is." This can help you further understand the title for this group in our topic today. And as we'll be discussing, limits and rules are the door. This allows us to say, okay, here's what I allow in my life. Here's what I'm not going to allow. in my life, as opposed to the dangers associated with walls, also known as rigid boundary adherence, that we're going to be delving into momentarily. Love to start us out with this quote, and keep this quote in mind throughout the duration of our Groupinar today. So my name's Corey Pitts. I'm a duly licensed mental health and substance abuse clinician in the state of North Carolina. Obviously, I'm a provider on the BetterHelp platform, but also a provider on the Teladoc platform. And full-time, I work for UNC Hospitals in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, of which on all the platforms, working with individuals in individual counseling settings, group counseling settings, among other areas. My treatment approaches tend to be eclectic, which means I have knowledge in several theories and interventions and tend to utilize those that best suit the needs of the clients in which I'm working with. Today, one of those interventions we're going to be looking at is boundary setting, namely limits and rules that we place with use of assertive communication. Again, in the latter half, we're going to be looking at that. In the first half, though, we're going to gain a further understanding as to what exactly personal boundaries are, as well as categories and types of boundaries that we typically see. We hear this term personal boundaries all the time. So what exactly are personal boundaries? Simply put, personal boundaries are the limits and rules that are set within relationships for ourselves. And the cool thing about this is they allow us to say no when we need to, but it also allows us to be able to open up to aspects of intimacy, aspects of close relationships. Remember that quote, walls keep everyone out, boundaries teach people where the door is. And as many of you will discover once we start delving into these categories and types, a lot of the boundaries that you have will be correlative to others, whereas some of the boundaries you have will be unique to you. There's no right or wrong way to go about the limits and rules that you set. So be mindful of that too. I get a lot of questions on that commonly. So the types of boundaries, or the categories, if you will, that we're going to be looking at in more detail are the 6 listed here. There's 2 of these that have been significantly influenced by the global pandemic, of which are physical boundaries as well as time boundaries, the limits and rules placed surrounding personal touch, as well as the limits and rules placed around how one uses their time. Other categories of boundaries we're going to be looking into more specifically: intellectual boundaries, emotional boundaries, material boundaries, and another very important one, sexual boundaries, the limits and rules one places around aspects of sexual behavior and intimacy. So to delve more specifically into these, starting first with physical boundaries, again, one of the 2 areas we've seen significantly influenced by the global pandemic. These refer to the limits and rules surrounding one's personal space, as well as physical touch. Healthy physical boundaries include an awareness of what's appropriate, as well as what's not appropriate in various settings, as well as in certain type of relationships. The example referenced here: should I hug, shake hands with someone, kiss? Now, this has been influenced by the pandemic because many of you can relate. You may have been comfortable prior to the pandemic of shaking somebody's hand, maybe giving them a hug, only to find that after this past year, a lot of the limits and rules you had in that regard have been influenced. And for those of you in attendance that are huggers, that enjoy personal touch, that's okay. But please be mindful of another person's boundary. It may not be your intention, but you hugging without asking somebody is a boundary violation. So please be mindful of that. Physical boundaries may be violated if someone touches you when you don't want them to, or when they invade your personal space in some way. The example listed is if somebody rummages through your bedroom. And think about it, back to that hugging example. It may not be the intention, but for somebody who has limits and rules surrounding personal space and physical touch, it's unnerving. And if someone's not aware as to how to communicate that assertively, it can leave one harboring feelings of resentment, shame, frustration, whatever the case may be. So those are physical boundaries. Next are intellectual boundaries. These refer to a person's thoughts as well as their ideas. And healthy intellectual boundaries include a respect, very important word, respect for others' ideas and an awareness of appropriate discussion. Now, notice in this, and I like to point out, this doesn't say accepting others' ideas. Please recognize the dichotomy. Respecting and accepting are 2 totally different things. You can respect somebody's idea, but not agree with it, and communicate by saying, I don't agree with that. However, I respect that that's something that's important to you. That is healthy boundary consideration. And the example referenced is the cliche, should we talk about the weather or should we talk about the politics? And similar to what we discussed in physical boundaries, many of you may find that there's variation in the limits and rules. Some of you, in regards to physical boundaries, may be okay with shaking hands. Others of you may not be. Similar with intellect. Some of you may be comfortable talking about politics with your family. Some of you may very well not be comfortable talking about politics with your family. Understanding that variation and what works for you. And intellectual boundaries are violated when someone dismisses or belittles another person's thoughts or ideas. This may look something along the lines of, well, I just have so much disrespect for your belief in that regard. That's a boundary violation. Instead, saying something like, I have difficulty agreeing to that viewpoint. However, I respect that that's something that's important to you. Again, that's healthy boundary consideration. So those are intellectual boundaries. Next are emotional boundaries. These refer to a person's feelings. And healthy emotional boundaries include limitations on when to share, as well as when not to share personal information. The example referenced, and I love to use this one, a gradual sharing of personal information during the development of a relationship is healthy, as opposed to the moment you meet somebody, you're telling them everything about yourself. This is more of an example of what we call porous or non-existent boundary, to be discussed momentarily. And emotional boundaries are violated when someone criticizes, belittles, or invalidates another person's feelings. So sadly, we see a lot of this occurring. Many of the clients to which I work with experience this on a daily or weekly basis. It's a boundary violation. You don't have to agree you don't have to agree, if you will, with somebody's emotion, but acknowledge and validate that they're experiencing that emotion. That's healthy boundaries. I see this is upsetting to you. I see that this frustrates you. I hear that you're upset about this situation, as opposed to gaslighting. Oh, get over it. You're blowing it out of proportion. Sadly, we see more of the latter. So challenge yourself in that ways, and not only understanding your limits and rules in that regard, but others' limits and rules. And when in doubt, ask. Those are emotional boundaries there. The gradual sharing of information as opposed to revealing everything to everyone. Very important not to violate that. Very important. Next are sexual boundaries. These refer to the emotional, intellectual, as well as the physical aspects of sexuality. And healthy sexual boundaries involve a mutual understanding, and here's this word again, respect of limitations and desires between sexual partners. And sexual boundaries can be violated with unwanted sexual touch, pressure to engage in sexual acts, any form of coercion, leering, or any form of sexual comments. So when in doubt, ask. Couples, new couples especially, have conversations about the limits and rules within sexual realms. Hey, I'm comfortable with this behavior, but I'm not comfortable with that behavior. And attempting to compromise, as we'll be discussing momentarily. And our last two here, first are material boundaries. These refer to our money, our belongings, our possessions, and healthy material boundaries involve setting limits on what you will share and with whom you will share that with. The example referenced is it may be appropriate to lend a car to a family member, to lend your car to a family member. Some of you may cringe at that idea and say, no, I'll never let anybody in my family borrow my car. That's where the variation comes in. It's okay if you do not want somebody in your family, to borrow your car, or if you're not comfortable with it. That's all right. It's your limit and rule. Embrace that. But it's not, from a general sense, probably healthy to lend your car to somebody that you met this morning. Again, that's an example of a porous or non-existent boundary. Material boundaries are violated when someone steals or damages another person's possessions, or when they pressure them to give or lend their possessions in some way. So those are material boundaries. And finally, another huge consideration in regards to the pandemic in conjunction with those physical space, the personal boundaries there, are time boundaries, the limits and rules as to how one uses their time. And to have healthy time boundaries, a person must set aside enough time for each facet of their life, such as work, relationships, and hobbies. The reason why this has been influenced by the pandemic, a lot of the limits and rules surrounding work during the pandemic, working from home, became very porous. A lot of uncertainty as to those limits and rules, working well beyond those scheduled hours that would be adhered to if a person were presenting in office in a personal setting of some sort. Research suggests that on average, people reported over the past year working 20 to 30% longer hours during the week as opposed to what they were working personally. So a lot of conversation has occurred over the last year in revisiting those limits and rules surrounding how one uses their time, namely within realms of work. And time boundaries are violated, similar to the example I had used, when another person demands too much of another's time, whether it be an employer, whether it be another person in one's life, whatever the case may be. So those are time boundaries. So now that we have an understanding of some of the common categories of boundaries, it can be important to delve further into types of boundaries. The goal here ultimately, and as we'll be discussing in the latter half, will be using healthy boundary adherence in use of assertiveness to set a particular boundary. But before we get to healthy boundaries, it's important that we have an understanding of the opposite ends of the spectrum. Healthy boundaries are that useful middle ground. On one end, we have what's called rigid boundaries, also known as a wall. Remember that quote, walls keep everyone out. And for you visual learners in attendance today, you'll like this. We're going to have more specifics on the slides and delving into these with the images posted again. But look at that. Surrounds the person, things can't come in, things can't go out. We're going to be discussing the dangers of that. The opposite end, we have loose or porous, also known to an extreme degree of limited or non-existent boundary. As we'll be discussing, and as you can see, there's a little bit of structure, but as the name implies, there's pores. So there's structure, but it's not consistent structure. It's not to a point to which it provides stability long term. And limited and non-existent, self-explanatory, there literally is no structure. There are no limits and rules. This presents its own dangers too in conjunction with rigid boundary adherence. And then lastly, as mentioned, we'll be looking into healthy boundary adherence. What consists of healthy boundaries, how to understand if one has healthy boundaries, how others have healthy boundaries, things of that nature. So starting first with rigid boundary adherence. And I'll reference a question I get commonly. It would be, Corey, why is it that either I know of somebody who has rigid boundaries or I myself have rigid boundaries? It's not always the case, but commonly rigid boundary adherence is in response to being hurt in some way. We see this commonly from survivors of trauma. I've been hurt, neglected, hated on in so many ways. And because of that, I'm going to put a wall up around me so that I never get hurt again. And initially, this sounds like a good idea, right? But walls keep everyone out, everything out. Things can't come in and things can't go out. So commonly, a trait we see with rigid boundary adherence is an avoidance of intimacy, an avoidance of close relationships, largely due to that fear and not allowing vulnerability. Well, if I allow vulnerability, I'm opening myself up to being hurt. And if that's you in attendance today and you're recognizing that discomfort with vulnerability, that's okay. Acknowledge that. Work with your counselor in building comfort with vulnerability and asking yourself when it's appropriate and comfortable for you to allow such vulnerability to occur. Furthermore, those who have rigid boundaries are unlikely to ask for help. Again, the reason being, well, if I ask for help, that's letting something out and it's opening up to let something in. And I'm not comfortable with that. So I'm not going to ask for help. I'm just going to get through it myself. I'm going to try to figure this out on my own. Those who have rigid boundaries also have very few close relationships. Again, you can see the theme here because vulnerability to a degree is required in efforts to solidify healthy relationships. Relationships are about give and take, right? So rigid boundary adherence involves few close relationships because another person may be giving, and not receiving. So a lot of people retract from that. I feel like this person's not interested in me. I've tried to open up to this person and I'm not receiving anything back. So they retreat from that. Those who have rigid boundaries are very protective of personal information. It's okay to be protective as you're forming a relationship. Obviously, when you meet somebody for the first time, you're not going to share your social security number or bank account information. But as you get to know somebody, you gradually share, as we had referenced there. But rigid boundary example is if someone's known someone for, say, 3 to 6 months, and they're still, I don't want you to know where I live. I don't want you to know details about my past. That, for example. Those who have rigid boundaries may seem detached, even with romantic partners. And a question I get commonly, and if you want to ask this, feel free to do so, we can reference it. How do I assist a romantic partner or a spouse who has rigid boundaries? It can be challenging, but coming from a place of love and compassion, asking the person how you can assist them in aiding in building vulnerability as well as trust. And lastly, and we've been discussing this point, rigid boundary adherence is largely due to keeping others at a distance to avoid the possibility of rejection. The pain of rejection is too much for me to bear, whether it be again or at all, so I put up a wall so that I'd never have to experience that. Well, I'm here to tell you today, I know it's uncomfortable and unnerving to be hurt, to be rejected. I'm human too, I get that. But this is a part of growth. Sometimes we have to experience rejection in order to further understand vulnerability. Vulnerability is a double-edged sword. On one end, it can allow us to pursue aspects of relationships to which we could not get to unless we allow the vulnerability. But the opposite end of that is we're also opening ourselves up to the likelihood of rejection or being hurt in some way. And that's okay if you're uncomfortable with that. But building comfort with that discomfort is a great way to reduce rigid boundary adherence. So that's rigid boundary, keeping others at a distance to avoid the possibility of rejection. Now, the opposite end of that, we're going to reference loose or porous, which is very similar to limited or non-existent. We're not going to look into detail of the limited or non-existent because it's an extreme degree of porous boundary. So similar to the reference of rigid boundaries as to why persons adhere to that, I get the question commonly too, well, why does this person have porous boundaries, or why do I have porous boundaries? Well, commonly the response to that I give is those who have porous boundaries also fear rejection, but in a different way. It's a fear of rejection if they don't comply with other people. So it's an over-involvement in certain aspects to ensure that they don't experience rejection by being over-involved in somebody else's problem or difficulty. So commonly some behaviors we see with porous boundaries is an oversharing of personal information. Now I get the question here commonly, well, what would be an example of oversharing? An example would be if you just meet somebody and you're sharing aspects of intimate conversation, if you will. So talking about your sexual behaviors, for example, talking again like bank account information the moment you meet somebody. It's an extreme example and it may not always happen, but we all know of somebody, at least in our lives, who is an oversharer. And for those of us who have healthy boundaries, it's unnerving. It makes you feel uncomfortable being around these persons, right? So it's this oversharing of personal information. Another huge trait of porous boundaries, and I talk about this in the assertiveness grouping, difficulty saying no to the requests of others. No is a two-letter word that is one of the more powerful words in the English language when used properly, but so many people fear it. It has become this word that's been influenced as, oh, it's bad when you say no to people. And I get it. No, saying no is challenging. But if the difficulty saying no to the request of others is due to a fear of rejection, it's likely an example of porous boundary adherence. So if a person is experiencing difficulty saying no because, oh, what are they going to think about me? It's important to be mindful of that and challenging that effectively. Porous boundaries also involve an over-involvement in other person's problems. An example may be, say, a helicopter parent's child is going out on a date and they call the child 4 to 6 times. Hey, I want to talk to the person you're with. I want to FaceTime you. Show me the person. I want to talk to them. That's an over-involvement. That's a boundary violation in its own right. Porous boundary adherence also involves a dependence on the opinions of other people. An example I like to use, say somebody wears some clothes to work, hoping to receive validation for, say, I don't know, somebody that they have a crush on in the work setting and don't receive that, they would be crushed. They would be upset to a degree to which they couldn't carry on with their day. This is a porous boundary adherence example. Those who have porous boundaries also are accepting of abuse or disrespect. Oh, they're just having a rough day, or oh, they always talk about this when they're mad. I'm here to tell you today, acceptance of abuse or disrespect is not okay. Nobody deserves that. And I know it can be challenging to stand up to that, but that is a trait of healthy boundaries and assertiveness, recognizing when things are violating a limit and rule that you have and having the courage to say, you know what, I'm not okay with the way you're talking to me. I'm not all right with the way that you touch me, the way that you put your hands on me in this way. And I'm not going to allow this anymore. That's setting a boundary. That's using assertiveness respectfully. So that's porous boundaries, a fear of rejection if one does not comply with the needs of another person. So the healthy middle ground is what we call healthy boundaries. An integral trait of healthy boundaries, and this is a great trait to assess not only within yourself, but others. Something I like to say here is you learn the most about somebody when you tell them no. I tell my clients this all the time, and it's an integral trait of healthy boundaries. Those who have healthy boundaries are accepting when others say no to them. So for those of you that tend to say, well, I don't want to say no to my friends or my family because they might not talk to me anymore. That's all right. That has more to do with them than it does you. A healthy boundary response when you tell somebody no would be, oh, I'm disappointed. I hate we can't spend time together this weekend, but I understand you have some other things that may be taking up your time. I look forward to being able to meet with you again, say in the next 1 to 2 weeks, as opposed to, oh, you always cancel last minute. You're so lame. Why do you do that? Right? If you hear that response, remember what I just said. When you tell somebody no is when you learn the most about them. Furthermore, those who have healthy boundaries value their own opinions. They don't think things like, well, I'm selfish for speaking up for myself respectfully. I'm selfish for setting a limit and rule. There's nothing wrong with setting a limit and rule and using assertiveness so long as you're being respectful in how you do it. Furthermore, those who have healthy boundaries do not compromise their values for others. As we'll be discussing in the latter half, boundaries are based on our values, the things that are most important to us. And the power of boundaries is it protects the things that are most important to us. More to come on that. And if you've attended my assertiveness group in R, and I said this too earlier, it's always beneficial in use of assertiveness to attempt to compromise. But this doesn't mean compromising your values. It means offering a compromise based on your values. We'll look at some examples of that momentarily. Those who have healthy boundaries also share personal information in an appropriate way. I get a lot of questions on this one too. They don't overshare, don't undershare. So an example would be, just as we had looked at a moment ago, a gradual sharing of information. When the moment you meet somebody, it's likely you're not going to share things about yourself compared to building the relationship 3 to 6 months down the road. You should be sharing more at that point because you're building trust. Okay, I trust telling this person a bit more about myself. That's healthy. But the moment you meet somebody, I'm going to tell you everything about me and I'm an open book and you can ask me anything and I'll answer it. That's not healthy. Largely due, there's a higher likelihood of being taken advantage of in those instances, even by those who have well intentions and well means. So lastly, those who have healthy boundaries know their personal wants and needs, and as we'll be discussing, know how to communicate those wants and needs effectively. Here's what I'm able to do. Here's what I'm not able to do. What are your thoughts on this? I'm not comfortable with the way you talk to me here. Please do not do that anymore. So those are traits of healthy boundaries that I encourage you to be mindful of in the latter half of our discussion with application strategy. So a few more considerations on boundaries before we pause for our first break for questions. And yes, many of you may have already asked this in the chat pod. I've yet to look. You may be recognizing, hey, Corey, I have a mix of different boundary types. That's all right. The example reference, you may say, hey, I have really healthy boundaries at work, but I'm noticing maybe my boundaries in romantic relationships are porous or non-existent. Or maybe there's members of my family, to which I have healthy boundaries, but others to which I have more rigid or porous or non-existent. That's okay. Recognize those areas, and those that are more porous, non-existent, or rigid, challenge yourself to adhere to some more of those traits we looked at in regards to healthy boundaries in those settings. Secondly, the appropriateness of boundaries depends heavily on setting. The obvious example here worth mentioning, what's appropriate to say when you're out with friends may not be appropriate to say when you're at work. It may be appropriate for you to say at work. Depends on the limits and rules, the structure, the limits and rules within workplace settings, the limits and rules of your friend groups. So you can see the variation there. Again, when in doubt, ask questions. And lastly, cultural considerations. Some cultures have very different expectations when it comes to boundaries. For example, in some cultures, it's considered wildly inappropriate to express emotions publicly, whereas in other cultures, emotional expression is encouraged. And this is a great place when in doubt to ask. Become culturally aware. Do research on different cultures as it relates to limits and rules, emotional expression. Befriend individuals of different cultures, backgrounds from you, and ask appropriate questions. Coming from a place of respect, this can assist you in not only solidifying some of your limits and rules, but also understanding those limits and rules within different cultural contexts, which is a very important point to consider. So we'll pause for our first break. Thanks for your patience up to this point as we'll pick up where we left off. We have some participants from all over the world, so welcome to you, fellow North Carolinian. Welcome to you today. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for those that shared your reasons for attending. I do hope at this point you're starting to gain some insight as to what boundaries are, the categories, and the types. Wonderful. Great question to start us off. How do I let people know what my physical boundaries are, especially possible romantic partners, without coming off rude? Excellent question. As we'll be discussing, when we take responsibility for our emotions and in consideration of our limits and rules, we use what's called I statements. I feel X when this happens. I feel uncomfortable when you touch me this way. It may not be your intention, but here's what I would prefer. I know you may like to hold me this way, but why don't we hold hands instead? Does that work for you? Do you see how that rolls off? We're taking responsibility for our emotion. We're coming from a place of respect. We're not saying, don't touch me there or don't do that. We're taking responsibility. I feel this when that happens. So when in doubt, use I statements. We're going to touch on that briefly in some of the application strategies, but great question to get us started there. Just reading here. This is a good question. I'm so sorry if this is occurring in the person who had shared live, but I hear this one commonly, unfortunately. What to do if your family's adamant that invalidating, criticizing, and belittling is not harmful because it's done with love to protect and help you see differently? Well, that statement in of itself is a violation, and using love as that violation, because love involves a respect to the limits and rules one sets, right? Doesn't mean we have to accept it, but it would instead be a response of, hey, I respect that this is important to you, as opposed to, I don't care what it is you have to say, but this is coming from a place of love. No, that has more to do with family of origin and the person saying that thing to you, and that is an incorrect statement. That is not a loving statement. And I encourage you, if you're comfortable, challenge that. Hey, I've learned about boundaries. And although you say this may be your intention, it's similar to that first question I referenced. I statements. I feel that you invalidating me is upsetting, or I'm upset by the fact of invalidation, and using love as justification. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I don't want you to do anymore. Use that I statement, not the accusatory pointing of the finger you statement. Great questions off the bat. Thank you all. Another great question. Love it. What is a way we can communicate when the boundaries are broken? What are some consequences that can be asserted should someone break them? Excellent question. Revisit the limit and rule you've set. Hey, it makes me uncomfortable when this happens. Let's use the example of verbal abuse. It makes me uncomfortable when you speak to me in this way. Should you continue to speak to me in this way, I'm going to walk away for 10 minutes to cool off. Should it continue, maybe I'll go stay with a friend, a family member. Remember, when we understand our limits and rules and we take responsibility for our emotion, what we do at that point is we are communicating how we're going to respond should somebody not respect our limit and rule. And I get it, it's scary. I get it. There's going to be people that buck that. They're not going to like it. They're going to get angry. They're going to become defiant and rage. But that doesn't mean you have to tolerate that. You've established the limit and rule. You've set the boundary. So at that point, it's on the other person. Should they continue to act in a way that's not in adherence to your limits and rules, you get to choose as to how you respond to that. Isn't that powerful? It's a wonderful thing. I'm not going to allow this. Should it continue, here's how I am going to respond to it. We're not making other person change. We can't change other people, but we can say, here's how I'm going to respond if this behavior continues. So that would be a suggestion there. Wonderful question. Another great one. How do you set boundaries without hurting the person you are setting boundaries with? It's a good question, and I'll just be blunt. There's going to be times you set boundaries and it's going to upset somebody. And this is just a sneak peek. I talk about this more in the assertiveness group in R. But it's really important when you set a boundary, you're not saying no to a person, you're saying no to a request, circumstance, or a behavior. And if you confuse those two, you're likely going to be reluctant to set your boundary because of the fear of, well, if I set my boundary, I'm going to hurt the other person. Sometimes you have to say this to them. I hear you're upset and I hate that. However, I'm setting this boundary because I'm not okay with you coming over unannounced on the weekends, not because I'm saying no to you. Challenge yourself in that way. Do not be reluctant to set a boundary due to the fear of how somebody may react to it. And I get it, it's easier said than done, but most people who start adhering to this do find and report, sometimes even in these groupinars, I feel less stress. I feel more as if I have a say in what happens in my life. And that empowers me. That makes me feel confident. Will be the response eventually. Awesome questions, everyone. Again, you will receive a recording of this groupinar in its entirety, concluding the groupinar you'll have access to for a period of 7 days. So check your email for that recording. Somebody asks, this is a good one. I could get on a soapbox about this, and I kind of reference it. Why is vulnerability a good thing? Because it allows our true colors to show. The moments we build comfort in being vulnerable and what can come from vulnerability in certain healthy relationships is such a powerful thing. But many are so cowardice of vulnerability because of the opposite end that it can produce: hurt, rejection, feelings of resentment, guilt, shame. And I argue this is the part of the process of finding the ideal partner, the ideal friend groups, experiencing that rejection. We all experience it to a degree, and I'm so sorry for those who have experienced it. But it is crucial to growth, as opposed to avoiding the possibility of rejection. That all that does is perpetuate more avoidant behavior, of which increases anxiety, depression, the works. So that's why vulnerability is a good thing, in my opinion. So we will pick up where we left off on the questions, and I see some interaction amongst members. So thank you for that. It's a wonderful thing. So I'm going to pause where we had, pick up where we left off. Wonderful questions. Love this group today. Thank you for your questions. I do hope the ones we were able to reference were of benefit for other attendees. So the latter half, as mentioned, we're going to talk about application strategies. I mentioned this earlier, but it's worth mentioning again. Boundaries are based on our values, or the things that are important to us. The example listed is a wonderful one. If you value time with your family, your limits and rules about working late are going to look much different than somebody who does not value that as much as you. Why is that? If you work late, something that is of value to you, you are not receiving. Think of boundaries that way. Okay, well, if I don't set a limit and rule here, I'm going to miss out on something that's important to me. So the boundary would be, hey, here's the time I would like to be off. What are your thoughts on this? What are some ways we can attempt to compromise based on this? Or even saying no politely. I'm not able to work when you're asking me to, as I have time planned with my family. However, here's some time where I'm not having time with my family to which I can work. See how we offer a compromise based on the value? Very important. Your boundaries are yours and yours alone. As I'd mentioned at the onset, many of the boundaries might align with those who are close to you, but others of those boundaries will be unique to you. That's okay. Build an understanding of the limits and rules in your life. If uncertain, ask your counselor. We have plentiful materials on boundary exploration, and I'd highly encourage, if you haven't looked into those already, to inquire with your counselor about that and build further upon those concepts of boundaries in your life. Know your boundaries before you enter a situation. Wonderful, wonderful suggestion. It's going to make it less likely that you do something that you're not comfortable with. Guess what? All of you have a counselor in your pocket with cell phones. If you're about to be entering in a situation, I do this with my clients. They message me, hey, I'm experiencing a situation, or I'm about to have a difficult conversation with somebody, or I'm planning on setting a boundary with somebody in the next couple of days. You can role play situations on the messenger, live sessions. This is going to aid you in building confidence. When you have a plan as to how you'd like the conversation to go, and you know what you're okay with and not okay with, then setting that boundary is going to come off the tongue. does not go in line with my limits and rules. I'm not okay with that. Ding. Okay, I need to set a boundary here. So here's a few example statements as to what to say. Remember, I don't care what anybody has told you. I'm a professional. Hear it from me. You always have the right to say no. When you say no, express yourself clearly. Do not be ambiguous or unclear. We're going to look at examples here in a bit as to appropriate ways to set boundaries so that there's no doubt as to what it is that you're wanting. Say some of these statements with me. I'm not comfortable with this. I can't do that for you. Please don't do that. Not at this time. I've decided I don't want to do that. Do you see how it's not ambiguous? I'm not saying, well, I'm really not comfortable with that. I'm not okay with that. I'm drawing the line at this. See how it rolls? It's not ambiguous. It's clear, concise, and assertive. So wonderful reference point there. And when we set boundaries, and this is where some of the assertiveness pieces come in, and if you've attended this groupinar, you'll recognize some of the concepts. Again, if not, highly encourage you to check it out because we spend an entire hour looking at it. Use confident body language. Face the other person, chest out, shoulders back. Make eye contact, steady tone of voice, just as I'm talking to you all today. I don't want to be talking quiet like this. And I also don't want to be talking at you like that, but a nice, steady tone of voice, loud enough to which you can hear me. And if you find you're experiencing anxiety when setting the boundary, try gradually slowing down what it is that you're trying to say, just as what I'm doing right here. Not to the point where I'm talking like this, because that can be perceived as sarcasm and can evoke somebody. But if I gradually slow it down when I'm talking with somebody, see how that slows down the cadence of the conversation? Take responsibility for you and apply these skills so that you can gain control of your emotions there. Be respectful. Love this phrase here with boundaries. Respect is paramount. Avoid yelling, using put downs. Do not give the silent treatment. It is totally all right to be firm, but almost always your message is going to be better received if you are respectful. Case in point, been practicing for about 6 years. Clients in which I've encountered both virtually and in person that have been combative, aggressive, defiant. When I come from a place of respect and use assertiveness, 90% of those persons de-escalate. So too it will happen in 90% of cases in your life. When you come from a place of respect and you use that confident body language, somebody will de-escalate. Again, planning ahead. Know what it is you'd like to say, how you'd like to say it before you enter these difficult conversations. This is going to aid you in building that confidence, even if you feel as if that confidence is not there. When you have a plan, you say, oh, okay, I've gone over this. I've gone through role playing. I've talked about things I'd like to say here. Okay, that makes me feel better, as opposed to going in, oh, shoot, I don't know what's going to happen here. And another wonderful piece of not only boundary setting, but assertiveness is compromise. When it's appropriate, listen to and consider the needs of another person. You never have to compromise, but give and take is a part of any healthy relationship. Hey, I can't do this today. However, I have time next week to which I could do this. Does that work for you? Hey, I'm unable to work this weekend. However, I can do an extra day next Wednesday. Is that all right with you? See how that works? We set the boundary, but we offer a compromise based on our value. Put a nice little bow on it and we hand it to another person asking something of us. That way they can determine if they're okay with solving the problem or coming up with a solution. Because we've told them what we can or can't do. That's the power of boundaries. Here's what I can do. Here's what I cannot do. We put a nice bow on it and we hand it to them. And they hold it and they can say, okay, I'm going to accept this, or no, I'm going to put this down, or I'm going to give it back to you. Very important. We don't have to shift our boundaries if somebody says no to it. We can say something along the lines of, well, I hate that that was your decision, but let me know if things change. Would love to have a conversation about this with you further. So let's look at a few examples of ways in which to set boundaries. First example, you notice your roommate has been eating food in your fridge. You never discuss plans to share food, and frankly, you don't want them eating what it is you've bought. What value is being violated here? Physical, personal, material, right? The violation is you don't want them eating what you bought, and you open the fridge and your food's gone. Aha, here can be a place to which I can set a boundary. So when using assertiveness and boundary setting, a response may look something like this. I'd like to keep our food separate. If there's something of mine that you want, just please ask me before you take it. Is that all right with you? See, I immediately was not ambiguous. I used an I statement. I would like to keep our food separate. I set the boundary. I attempted to compromise. If there's something of mine that you want, please ask me before you take it. See how that was assertive? It was confident. There was no ambiguity there. Short, sweet, to the point. Next situation. This is a wonderful, great example here. Your friend calls you at 11 p.m. to discuss concerns they're having with their spouse. However, you need to wake up at 6 a.m. Huge time boundary violation here. And many may argue, well, Corey, what kind of friend would I be if I didn't stop what I was doing to talk with my friend? That's porous boundaries. You can be a good friend and saying no. And here's the response example that indicates that. Validating the feeling. I can tell you're upset. I can want to talk to you, but right now I need to go to bed. Compromise. Maybe we can talk tomorrow afternoon about this. I'd like to hear more as to what's been going on. That's being a good friend. That's all right. Being a good friend doesn't always mean saying yes and stopping everything you're doing the moment somebody needs something. That's not fair to you. Because if I were to stay up and talk with my friend at 11 o'clock, goodness knows how long we'd be on the phone, and I'm missing out on sleep, something to which I use a limit and rule in regards to the time. I value time for sleep. Aha, I need to set a boundary here. See how that works? Starts in our values. Values shape the limits and rules we place within these realms, of which includes the variability that can occur in setting boundaries. And I have some final points here on strengthening healthy boundaries. In our last 10 minutes or so, we will reference the chat pod once again for questions. Know your limits. Before you become involved, ask yourself, what am I okay with and what am I not okay with? It is best to be as specific as possible. Why? Oh, come on, just this one time. Oh, I care for you. Can we do this one more time? Oh, can I borrow the car? You let me borrow it last week. Over and over and over and over and over. Only you have to experience the resentment from that. Nobody else does. Everybody else in your life gets what it is they want except you. And what's fair about that? So set a boundary to allow yourself permission to do what's in your best interest. And for many of you, this may be the first time in your life to which you've done this. And I get it, it's scary, evokes a lot of anxiety. A lot of people on this step become very emotional for that reason. Allow yourself permission to know your limits and to do what's in your best interest by setting those appropriate boundaries. For the third time today, know your values. Every person's limits are different, and they're often determined by their personal values. The example, once again, if you value your family above everything else, it's going to lead to stricter limits and rules as to how late you will stay at work away from your family. Know what is most important to you and protect that at all costs. Similar to the boundaries material in the messenger, I encourage you to ask your counselor for some material on values exploration. Wonderful material. I can't recall the name of it. I think it's a values clarification. It lists several topics of values that you can rank on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being most important, 10 being least. This is a great activity to start prior to setting boundaries and visiting that. Know what's important to you and set your limits and rules based on what is most to least important to you. Listen to your emotions. Feelings are wonderful advisors, but they are horrible masters. So if you notice feelings of discomfort or resentment, please don't bury them. Try to understand. Ask yourself, what might this feeling be advising me of? What might this feeling might be trying to tell me, Resentment almost always is traced back to a feeling of being taken advantage of. I hear it time and time again with porous or non-existent boundaries. I feel so much anger and resentment towards people around me. And resentment is like drinking poison and attempting to assign the pain you feel to the person or thing you detest, only to experience all that pain yourself. Resentment is a very dangerous emotion. So use boundaries so that you don't have to carry that resentment anymore. Approach conversations. You know what? I'm not comfortable with this occurring anymore. I can't allow for this to happen anymore. That way you can release the resentment. You don't have to experience anymore. Have self-respect. If you're always giving in to others, ask yourself, am I showing as much respect to myself as I do to other people around me? Boundaries that are too open might be due to misguided attempts to be liked by elevating other people's needs above your own needs. So allow yourself that permission, once again, to do what is in your best interest, to respect yourself, to prioritize limits and rules you set. And no, it is not selfish. People are going to start telling you that because they don't like being told no and they don't like you setting a limit or rule. That's okay. You can acknowledge the emotion they're experiencing, but don't change the boundary because the person's upset. Instead, saying something, I see this frustrates you, and I hate that it occurred. Or even, I see this frustrates you. However, this isn't going to change things. That's okay. Acknowledge that. Have self respect. And some final points here in closing. This theme of respect, it's just as important having respect for other people. What does this mean? Make sure your actions aren't self serving at the expense of other people. Interactions should not be about winning, losing, taking. Instead, consider what's fair to everybody in a situation. Given the setting and the relationship, you might win, but at the cost of a relationship's long term health. This is why we offer compromise, because it maintains the relationship. It softens the no, if you will. We don't always have to offer it, but it's going to bolster relationship and it's going to make the no roll off the tongue much simpler. I can do this. I can't do that. What are your thoughts on this? Does that work for you? Being assertive. Don't be shy when it's time to set a boundary. Say no respectfully, but do not be ambiguous about it. If you can make a compromise while respecting your own boundaries, try it out. Again, this is a great way to soften the no and show respect to everybody who may be involved in a situation. And our final point, consider the long view. Some days you will give more than you take, and some days you're going to take more than you give. But ask yourself as it relates to setting boundaries, take a longer view of the relationships when it's appropriate. But if you're always the one who is giving or taking, there might be the problem. So whatever it is you may be in your boundary setting journey, don't lose hope. If you're starting, take this information, build upon it further with your individual counselor. If you're aware of boundaries and revisiting it, wonderful. Do a values exploration. Revisit some of those limits and rules, especially post-pandemic in some parts of the world, resuming somewhat normalcy, getting back into old routines that once weren't there during the pandemic. It's a great time to revisit some of those limits and rules. Don't lose hope. It's challenging, but build upon it. Practice makes perfect. Change is a continuum and is not an event. So thank you all for attending. Really hope you found this content to be of benefit. And as promised, our last 10 minutes or so, we will reference the chat pod for questions. See a lot of activity, so thank you for that. And thanks for your patience too, as we have close to 175 participants live. So love the interest in this topic. Always a popular topic amongst participants, as it's a very useful one. Very good question. As an adult young woman, how do I set better boundaries with my parents who constantly like texting me all the time, every day? I don't want to hurt their feelings, but I also want to be an adult. And I probably answered this in referencing another question, but to reiterate, when we set a boundary and say no, we're not saying no to a person. So you're not saying no to your parents, you're saying no to them texting you all the time. So this would be a great situation. Use that boundary setting. I'm not okay with you texting me at these times. However, I am okay if you send me text at this time. Does that work for you? Oh, well, you're telling me not to text you anymore. No, mom and dad, I'm not telling you not to text me anymore. And I'm not saying no to you. I'm saying that I'm not okay with you texting me at these times. Do you see how that works? Don't confuse the two, but that's a great example. Come from a place of respect, use those I statements, and attempt to compromise if appropriate. Great question. What if people see a boundary as disrespectful to their culture? How to deal with that? Again, have the conversation. Use what and how questions. Help me to understand what about my limits and rules are disrespectful to your culture. Come from that place of compassion and attempts to understand Most people are very receptive to that. You may get somebody every once in a while that is not, and knowing when to walk away. If somebody becomes aggressive, defiant, hurtful, set the boundary. Hey, I'm sorry. My intention was to understand. I hate that this upset you. However, I'm not okay with the way you're talking to me. See how that's calm, just rolls off the tongue. But yeah, when in doubt, ask and say that. My attempts here aren't to be disrespectful, just building upon cultural awareness there too. Very good point. How to manage coming off too strong and giving in too much. How to find that healthy middle ground. Now, this varies from person to person, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but revisit your limits and rules. Revisit some concepts to which you feel you're coming off too strong and concepts in which you felt you were giving too much. Recognize the themes of that. This is great stuff to unpack with your individual therapist. What about a situation correlated to you coming off too strong? What about this situation encapsulated you giving in too much and building insight in those realms? Good question. How to regain trust with a loved one whose boundaries they've realized they've been wearing down. Acknowledgement's the great first step. Acknowledge that the boundaries are being worn down. I recognize that my behaviors, actions, circumstance, whatever the case may be, have worn down your boundaries, and I'm sorry for that. What are some ways that I can assist you in rebuilding that? What are some ways that I could respect the limits and rules you have? Or an even better question, help me to understand some limits and rules you have. Go back to those categories. One of my favorite things to do with couples is a couples strength exploration, couples values clarification, a wonderful self-exploration activity, not only about one person, but their spouse or significant other. So really cool thing to do there. Great questions. Going to scroll down a little bit because I see there's a lot of activity. I want to make sure those who had asked questions later on, we have a chance to reference that. Somebody shares that they've recently started setting boundaries after recognizing having super porous boundaries for years. They recognize it's difficult. It leads to circular arguments. How to help with that? Don't lose hope. It's frustrating. Talk to your individual therapist about the frustration that comes about in the circular arguments. Take care of yourself. It's just as important. If an argument comes about or if there's an interaction that was emotionally taxing, embrace that. Process it with your counselor. It's trial and error. This is how we get better at boundaries. It's not like we wake up tomorrow and I'm a master at boundaries. No, I'm a clinician. I practice things with boundaries. I've practiced things with boundaries for years, and I learn new things about boundaries every day, not only in my practice, but personal life. It's trial and error. But we build upon that by having conversations with people about understanding, again, okay, what worked well for me here, what did not work for me, what worked well for me here, things of that nature. Good question. Somebody asked if they could use the feelings wheel, the anger iceberg. Yeah. And I believe at least the anger iceberg may be a material on the BetterHelp Messenger. But yes, these are great ways to manage emotion, to understand. So even before an interaction, use those tools. Okay, how am I feeling by not setting this boundary? How might I feel in setting that? Or even better, compare and contrast. Let me use the iceberg to talk about how I felt before. Now let me reflect on how I feel now that I've set the boundary. This will aid in solidifying that behavior. Excuse me. Boundaries with a demeaning boss who uses the silent treatment when they feel they're exerting their values or intelligence. This is another area, so sadly, I hear of boundary violation occurring, namely with people in supervisory positions. But a great way to do that is acknowledge it. I notice that you're silent when I share this, and this is how it makes me feel. I don't like that this occurs. What are some ways in which we could use less of this? Or help me to understand reasons behind that use. And it's likely, I don't know your boss or supervisor, but it's likely they could become defiant, further silent. We don't have to respond to somebody's affect. We can acknowledge how it makes us feel, use the I statement to communicate that, But remember, boundaries give us the freedom to choose how we respond to such behavior. So it may be appropriate there to say, hey, I would like to have conversations in exerting my values or exerting concepts of my intelligence, but I'm not going to be able to do that if I'm feeling invalidated by the silent treatment. That's appropriate, totally appropriate. So great question. How do you not take it personal when someone acts in rage or when you state your boundaries to another person? It's human nature. We do take it personally. We do get upset about things that happen when somebody reacts to us in anger when we set the boundary. It's okay. It's human nature. I'm not saying it's wrong or bad to take it personal. I'm saying acknowledge when that happens and allow the feeling to advise you as to how you'd want to proceed. That's the important piece, because it would be really simple in that personal reaction to react to that. I'm angry about this, knee jerk. I'm going to yell at somebody. I'm going to cuss somebody out. It's not productive. It harbors further resentment, further anger. But take that. What about this are you taking personal? Would be a question I would ask. Build upon that. Well, I feel invalidated. I feel hurt. I feel angry that somebody had the nerve to tell me that when I said about it. Great. Acknowledge that. How would you like to respond based on that? Not, hey, I'm angry. Let me yell at somebody or be mad, whatever the case may be. Great question. Another question I'll reference quickly. How to stop blaming yourself for not setting boundaries because you were too young. We don't know what we don't know, right? But the good thing is once we learn things, everything in the past, we can't change it. What's done is done, right? We can acknowledge the pain that comes from that, but we say to that in response, now I know more about boundaries, and because of that knowledge, let me challenge myself moving forward so that I don't experience whatever feelings I've experienced in the past. Is a great response to that. Question on how to be a good friend if the person's burned out and them venting a lot. Acknowledge it. I statement. I want to be your friend. However, I'm noticing that I'm becoming burned out with this conversation. Here's some ways I can assist you. Or even better, here's some times that I'm okay with you venting to me, but I'm not okay with the ongoing venting as this is how it's affecting me. What are your thoughts on that? What can I do that can be of assistance to you? That's a compromise statement there. What can I do to be of assistance? How can we work through this together? Remember, if we come from a place of respect and we offer compromise, it will likely go quite well. Yes, very good statement. Being consistent with the limits and rules you have set is the challenge. That's exactly right. Consistency is key. Know where it is you stand and don't back down from that. Because what's really neat is those who have consistent boundaries tend to be respected more. And a lot of people say, what? You mean when I start telling people no, they respect me more? Think about it. Let's use the example of Bob. For example. So Bob values time with family. Every time the boss asks Bob to work the weekends, Bob says no, so that Bob doesn't miss out on time with his family. You know how people respond to Bob? Wow, I really respect Bob because he doesn't allow things to get in the way of spending time with his family. That'll be the response you receive when you become consistent. And you may encourage another person to revisit their boundaries, to say things like, oh, wow, maybe I need to consider the limits and rules I've set. And one final question we'll reference. I'm going to scroll down. Again, sorry if I didn't get to all the questions. Yes, thank you. The recording is going to be sent to your email. All of you asking about it, the recording will be sent to your email momentarily. One final statement, or actually a question here. How to become, and we'll end on this, how to become more vulnerable while upholding boundaries. Allow yourself permission to run your own race. There's no time limit as to when you must be completely vulnerable. But use your limits and rules in conjunction with your vulnerability. Open yourself up and use the limits and rules as that shield, if you will, if you need it. It's that door, if you will. I'm allowing vulnerability. Here's my shield of boundaries. Oh, boundary. Oh, boundary. When we need it, right? That's the power of the door, right? So use that in assisting with the vulnerability. The more you know about your values and your limits and rules, then you can slowly expound upon concepts of vulnerability. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. My apologies we didn't get to all of the questions, but don't lose hope. Go forth, move forward, set boundaries. If you enjoyed this groupinar, check out some of my other groupinars I offer. I mentioned the assertiveness groupinar, rolling out some new ones on intuitive eating, the gut-brain axis, and one I've been doing on the trauma response. So hope you all have a wonderful rest of your morning, afternoon, evening. Again, go forth, be well, and check your email for the recording. And I do hope to see you in other groupinars to which